All right, thanks everybody for attending today. And if you haven't, if you're listening to the recording, thanks for listening to us. This is the Midwest Azure and Microsoft 365 user group, but we, also provide this globally, being that we're all virtual. So, but just the people that coordinate and organize these with myself are all based in the Midwest region of the United States. So I'm out of Michigan here with the mitten, which is easy to identify on a map. If you're from outside the United States, just look for the state that looks like a mitten. And we even get fancy with the upper part of Michigan. We'll do it this way to kind of show both parts of Michigan at times. But if you ever met anybody from Michigan, they'll be like, "Well, I live here," and they'll show where they live in Michigan. So. So just to, for those of you that are, I think the people that are attending today are, I've never attended one of our sessions before. The main focus and mission of our group is to create a learning environment around Azure, Microsoft 365, bringing in global community members on a monthly. I've actually had so many people that want to speak at my events. We've made this a twice a month event recently. So and we want to expand knowledge globally around the world around Microsoft. So I bring a lot of community members in this. Everybody's welcome to share. If anybody wants to provide a session, we do have a Sessionize out there, and it's available. You can find it on the website as well, which I'll give that. We don't provide any sales pitches on these calls. This is strictly a informational forum. So and here's the link to the website, and I can provide that to everybody in the chat as well, so that you have it. Let me do that real quick here. And like I said, it's got all of the future sessions, the meetup link, which I think that's where you found out how to get here today, as well as what we have coming up in the sessions. And thankfully, our speaker today has signed on to even come back already for in a couple months to provide some more training to us. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Shabaz. I'll let you do your introduction and everything, and just kind of put this as a placeholder. And today's topic, he's going to be talking about Windows Virtual Desktop and some of his lessons that he's found during the pandemic. So I'll turn things over to you and stop sharing and let you share your content. And welcome, Shabaz.
Thanks for the introduction. Appreciate it, and thank you for having me on today. I'll quickly share my screen. Is everyone able to see that?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So, welcome everyone to the Midwest Azure and Microsoft 365 user group. My name is Shabaz Darr. A little bit of information around my social media links there. I'm happy to share those afterwards as well. I'm happy to share the slide deck as well afterwards. So just a quick introduction about myself. So my name is Shabaz Darr. I'm a senior infrastructure consultant at Net Company in the UK. Just to point out that some of the experiences I'll be discussing are quite kind of the start of the pandemic. So I joined Net Company in October. So some of the projects that I did are kind of part of my old role as well as the new role that I'm doing. So I've been working in IT for 15 years, and 7 of those have been as a consultant, working around Microsoft Cloud technologies, so both Azure and Microsoft 365. Currently, in the last 7 years, I said my focus has been on Azure Endpoint Manager, and obviously in the last 12 months, I think it was last month, just in December, WVD was 1 year old. So I've been doing it for about 6 to 8 months, focusing on Windows Virtual Desktop. So my presentation isn't a technical overview of WVD, because there's loads of stuff out there around guides on how to install it and configure it and best practices. But what it is a look at my experiences I've had when deploying it, and especially in the pandemic, because it's brought so many challenges to everyone, in all types of businesses. So I thought it'd be good to share some of the lessons that I learned around implementing it, as well as the challenges I had with some of the clients and some of the users. So it's a very much a real world sort of look at what I did. So just to give a quick introduction, I do apologise. Sorry, I'm actually isolated from COVID at the moment. That's why my voice is a bit hoarse. So I do apologise about that. So yeah, just want to give a quick introduction about what I'm going to cover. So first of all, I'm going to go into some of the requirements and problems that clients had right at the beginning of the pandemic, and just how we went about solving those. I'll discuss why the clients chose Windows Virtual Desktop. Obviously, for those of us who have done consultancy or are a consultant, you don't always just go in with one idea. You try and go in with a few different ideas for the clients, and then you allow them to make the best judgment based on the requirements that they've got and also the feedback that you give them. So I'll go through why they chose WVD. And then I'll explain some of the challenges I've had around implementation during the last 6 to 8 months. And I'll try and focus on the areas I'll be focusing on, probably around more security, imaging, and some of the on-premises integration. And then finally, I'll just touch on, where are these customers now? How has Windows Virtual Desktop helped them during the pandemic? And what positives and negatives have they seen from using Windows Virtual Desktop? So as with most projects kind of that we work on, there's always a problem or kind of requirement. So just to set the scene, this was right at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The lockdown was looming, so we're talking in the UK anyway, late March to early April. Businesses all around the UK and the world, for that matter, I suppose, were looking at the prospect of sending their staff home, but needed to keep their businesses running. And frankly, in my own experience, a lot of them were not prepared. They didn't have a home or remote working facilities at all. And the sort of customers that I was dealing with, I would call them small to medium, so a maximum of 500 users, all the way down to what we guys call in the UK a two-man band, so a couple of users. So as I mentioned, the lockdown was looming, and one of the biggest requirements was their businesses and customers needed to send people home. They couldn't, because of the way the pandemic was growing and the cases that were coming up, people were being infected. It just wasn't safe to have people congregated in an office and an enclosed workspace. So they were looking at potentially sending and servicing work from home for hundreds of people. And what that meant is they were looking at either remote service like Windows Virtual Desktop, or issuing staff with laptops or mobile devices, which would mean many people hours building devices with no real way of managing those devices once they were issued. There was massively tight timescales. Like I said, it all revolved around the looming lockdown, especially in the UK. There was, with projects like this, in my experience, you normally get a good 6 to 8 weeks, maybe even longer, to at least put the designs, the implementation, the testing in place. But because of the extreme time constraints and the short amount of time to get a solution in place, we were talking, in my experience at the beginning of the pandemic, was 2 to 4 weeks turnaround. That's how tight the timescales were. So whatever the solution was going to be, whatever it was, if it was WVD, Citrix, whatever, it needs to be done in a short space of time. So that was a massive requirement and problem that needed to be solved. Just because we had tight timescales didn't mean that we were going to cut corners. So You know, there needed to be a robust solution that could easily scale. The initial requirements for a lot of clients that I dealt with was for key staff. However, with there being no timescales for COVID-19 ending, I mean, we're almost 12 months on. Well, let's say we're 10 months on now, and in the UK we've gone back into a third lockdown. So there's still no real end in sight. Obviously, the vaccines are being pushed out in the UK, so it's a lot more positive. But still, we could be here towards the end of the year, still where remote working is still a requirement. So there needed to be a solution which would scale up as the number of users increased quickly and easily. And as I'll discuss later on in the presentation, you know, a lot of the businesses are fully working from home, so I'll discuss that later on. Secure, the solution needs to be very secure. As with any solution, really, security is vital for a lot of clients. They want to ensure that, you know, their data, their property stays secure, their systems stay secure. And again, with a lot of users looking to use their own devices, especially during COVID-19 or during the pandemic, where businesses can't afford to give everyone a corporate device, they had to make sure that whatever solution was in place was secure, and you know, there was a line between personal and corporate data, and access was secure as well. Finally, on-premises integration was I found was a massive requirement, because a lot of the clients, again, small to medium clients that I dealt with, they had 95% of their infrastructure was hosted on premises. Most of the applications used by these medium to small businesses were hosted on premises, as well as, you know, having a requirement for integrating existing group policies to control user desktop experiences, and integrating with Active Directory on premises. These are all already in place, and they were used by the clients. So they wanted to ensure that, you know, that there was some sort of integration with whatever solution they went with. They obviously went with Windows Virtual Desktop, or I wouldn't really be here speaking about it. So what I'll just explain now is, you know, why did they go with Windows Virtual Desktop? Well, the main and only reason that matters is it solved all their problems. Obviously, Windows Virtual Desktop can be accessed from anywhere. So it's all you need is an internet connection. You don't need to have any sort of VPN, be it site-to-site or client-side VPN, to get users connected. Yes, you do need software, but this can be downloaded and installed very easily on a user's own device or corporate device. Like I said, there's no need for a VPN access to the Windows Virtual Desktop environment for user access. So it solved the work from home requirement / problem that a lot of the customers were facing. It can be implemented in a short space of time. At the time of the projects I worked on, WVD was in the fall release, so not in its latest iteration. So it was not available in the Azure portal. So a lot of the majority of configuration was done in PowerShell. And although I don't like to admit this, but I do like PowerShell. It's a really good tool, and I enjoyed using it. It's so much more easier now, with it being a couple of clicks to deploy Windows Virtual Desktop. But even with it being deployed and configured through PowerShell, it was still implemented in a very short space of time. As I mentioned, there was a public sector customer that I had. We had 2 to 4 weeks to turn it around, and we were able to do that. So WVD solved the time constraint problem. It's robust, highly available, and it scales up very quickly. It can all be automated. You can easily add new session hosts into the host pool. And again, now that it's in its spring update version through the Azure portal, it's a couple of clicks to get another host added. And as and when you need to increase the number of users, you can add more hosts very easily. So, you know, it kind of answered their requirement for needing a robust solution. Oops, sorry, slip of the mouse. The added benefit of being able to secure the solution with multi-factor authentication and conditional access was a massive tick next to Windows Virtual Desktop. With users working from all over the world, all over the UK, with all types of different devices. Some were working from iPads, some were working from Windows devices, some were even working from Macs for some reason. I don't know why. Not my favorite device, but all types of different devices. And the thing that secured it all was multi-factor authentication, and that allowed the clients to add a layer of security on top of the Windows Virtual Desktop, and it gave them that added knowledge that their infrastructure and system is at least secure. So not quite a feature of Windows Virtual Desktop, but the VPN, the site-to-site, the IPsec VPN from on-premises into Azure was a massive benefit. And again, it answered the problem and requirement that customers had for the on-premises integration. As I said, 95% of these clients' infrastructure was on-premises, so they needed that connection, and it had to be secure and encrypted, which the IPsec VPN is. And then again, because they were small to medium customers, they went with the Azure native VPN gateway rather than a virtual network or network device in Azure. Excuse me. So as with all projects I've worked on anyway, they all come with implementation challenges. I hope that's not just me. So as I mentioned earlier, I didn't mention earlier, but on some of the projects, I was brought in specifically for implementation. So a lot of the design was done beforehand. There were other projects where I did the design as well, but in the cases where I was just implementing, there were some challenges that I faced when doing the implementation. So what I found one of the major hurdles was getting the correct Windows image into Azure. So a particular customer, I remember they had their own kind of golden Windows 10 image, which they wanted the Windows Virtual Desktop session host to have. So this was very much your old kind of, if anyone's worked with SCCM or the WDS, is it Windows Deployment Services, where you literally build a golden image around, let's say, a laptop. You install Windows 10, patch it, add all your software, and then you capture that image. They very much followed that sort of process for their deployments on premises and for their user devices. And they wanted that same Windows 10 image to be on their Windows Virtual Desktop. Unfortunately, we ended up using, because I remember this because this was my mistake as well. Unfortunately, we initially ended up using the standard Windows 10 Pro operating system. And for those who don't know, with the multi-session feature in WVD, you have to use a specific supported operating system. And there is a Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session OS that you have to use. Unfortunately, the first time I did it, again, a lot of things at the beginning of the pandemic and just the amount of pressure on this particular project, I ended up just throwing on Windows 10 Pro. Luckily, we had a robust testing plan, and that pretty much picked up very quickly that only 2 people could log in at a time. So we had to go through the whole imaging process again. A very harsh lesson, learned the hard way. But I have like a little saying that I'll make a mistake once, but I sure as hell will not be making it again. And I haven't made that mistake since. So I've learned my lesson. But the point is, that I did learn that lesson. We then followed the correct process by creating a VM in Azure, importing that into Hyper-V, and using this as the base for our image. We then uploaded the completed image back into Azure, did a capture, and then that was kind of implemented. It's good when you can talk about these things, with a bit of humor afterwards, but it wasn't funny at the time. Multi-factor authentication users. As mentioned earlier, we implemented multi-factor authentication with conditional access as an added layer of security. I remember one particular customer where they were already using Office 365, but they had not implemented multi-factor authentication as part of that. So it's going to be literally it's going to be the first time these users had experienced multi-factor authentication. During the testing process, it appeared to be simple enough, but we had issues when the users were testing, and we created some documentation user guides for the users on how to register their devices in MFA and how to generally use it, some best practices. We found users, I'm sure you've all found this before, we found users weren't following the documentation correctly, and things like personal devices were being enrolled into Intune, even though there was clear instructions on not to tick a specific tick box, people were still ticking it. And then people were registering incorrectly and locking themselves out. They were downloading the correct authentication app. I could go on and on about the number of problems that we had with it, even though everything was documented and they were given to the users. We can't control how the users follow documentation, but it meant we had to go into much more granular detail with the user guides and documentation to try and mitigate that. Literally spelling things out in, with images and all sorts, and it was a way we had to get around that sort of problem. It's not something that we can control as IT professionals. You can't control how someone's going to follow instructions. All we could do was our best to try and make the documentation as detailed as possible. But it was a massive challenge, I found. Another big challenge was getting the on-premises integration. Now, it wasn't just a case of configuring the VPN. That was probably the easiest part of it. As I mentioned, we were looking to use the Azure native virtual gateway, and we had no issues with that. The complication was that they wanted the session hosts in Azure to be managed by Active Directory and group policy. So just in case you don't know, there's obviously Azure AD domain services, which is essentially a domain controller as a service. And what that allows you to do is add your session host to the managed domain within Azure. However, that's not connected to your on-premises Active Directory in the sense it syncs, but the sync goes from on-premises to Azure AD to Azure AD domain services. So Azure AD domain services is actually syncing with Azure AD. It's almost like the middle person is Azure AD. So there was no direct sync. So policies, etc., they were not syncing up. It would have needed ADFS sort of implementation to get that sync, and just the time constraints, we just didn't have that amount of time to put ADFS in place. So initially we implemented Azure AD domain services to allow the host to join the domain. However, like I said, it wasn't registering on premises and we just couldn't get group policy. So in the end, it required a change to the existing VNet DNS settings. And we had to change the DNS to point to the on-premises domain controllers. And once we did that, the session hosts were joining the domain managed on-premises, and they were registering with group policy and picking up all the correct group policies that the customer needed to have applied so they could get those controls in place. I know some of you probably think, why not use Intune? But a lot of I don't think the support wasn't on the integration wasn't in place at the time with Intune. I believe it is slowly getting there now. I think I saw something today actually on Twitter with some further Intune integration with Windows Virtual Desktop. But at the time, talking March, April, May, June time, that integration just wasn't there, so we couldn't have that integration. So these are some of the challenges that I experienced. So what I wanted to touch on in my presentation was, we're almost, like I said, we're almost 8, 9, 10 months on now. Where are these customers now? How have they adapted to this new, what is essentially was a new way of working for them? All these users were used to, getting the car or public transport into the office, sitting at their desk and working in a managed office. They're not being used to, staying in their pajamas or their gown and jumping on their iPad or their laptop. and this is a new way of working. So where are they now? What are the benefits they've seen? So one of the bigger customers, they're a public health service in the UK. At the time, they had 200 staff that they needed. The first requirement. So they're now working from home. It's now the new norm. Working from home is normal for them. It's not something new, or they're used to it, and they've had massive benefits. This shows that Windows Virtual Desktop deployment has solved the problem they had of getting users working remotely as quick as they could without having to issue new laptops. Unfortunately, MFA is still an issue. We still have, again, people that are new. I found that people that are still new to that process of registering device using multi-factor authentication, they're still having issues. Unfortunately, it's just all you can do is try and educate. It's been a massive learning curve for users who aren't used to MFA. It's necessary, and we just continue to try and educate the users the best we can through documentation and drop-in workshops and things like that. To put it simply, Windows Virtual Desktop has saved lives by allowing clients and businesses to send users home and continue to do their jobs in an efficient way. It helped lower the risk of people getting infected and spreading the virus. And those people, in turn, have been able to play a vital role in the fight against COVID-19, be it if they work for a health service or whatever work they're doing. They're all contributing to the fight against COVID-19 by staying at home, keeping them and their families safe. So that is actually the end of my presentation. It's short and sweet. Are there any questions?
Anybody have any questions? One thing that I'll say, Shabaz, is I've been somebody that's been around virtual desktop, not necessarily specifically Windows, but virtual desktop through Citrix as well as VMware Horizon, and the ability to have that level of consistency in user experience, along with the amount of security that it provides in terms of not having data residing on a local mobile device, whether it's a laptop or iPad or Android, is a great driver to moving to that. And the pandemic just kind of accelerated that. Of we need to deploy like you said, a golden image to our user environments on very short basis, especially in terms of frontline workers and people that were heading remote when they may have had a desktop sitting at their desk. I've worked for years on a laptop, so I was always mobile, but you don't think about these people that worked at a desktop and now having to pick that up and then have that all ready and available for them when they work from home. And the virtual desktop provides that to them, and also provides a level of comfort to the organization in terms of what they're going to, in terms of the security and the control they have over their data, which, like you said, with frontline workers, healthcare companies that have. In the United States, we have our HIPAA regulations. I know you've got the GDPR in UK and Europe, and having all those privacy parameters in place without being able to sit there and see somebody's physical machine is really a great thing. And I've worked and been and played with Windows Virtual Desktop. Actually wrote a cloud workshop for Microsoft around this, and getting into that environment and seeing what Microsoft has built, like you said, in terms of being able to deploy it quickly and everything. They've done an excellent job.
Like I said, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic when my first involvement in all this, and you probably hear it was massive news in the IT industry, but Microsoft were actually struggling to provision enough resources. And like I said, one of the projects I worked on, so I worked on the third deployment of Windows Virtual Desktop in Europe, I think it was. So it was the third deployment they'd done, Microsoft, and I worked quite closely with the fast track team, and literally you could not provision any resources in the UK, and we were lucky enough to be bumped up the list because it was a healthcare organisation. There's an article on Microsoft's website around it as well, and we were bumped up, and what should have been a 3-month waiting list ended up being 3 days, and we ended up getting the resources that we needed. But it was probably, you might not remember, it was a huge news that basically in the UK and Europe, you were very, very difficult to provision any VMs. People were having to provision them in US East, which obviously isn't ideal with GDPR and all that sort of stuff that was going on. One thing I love about it is that, so I've come from an on-premises background in my experience before I started looking at cloud. RDS on-premises, when you configure that, if you've had any experience, obviously there's so many different roles you have to do, and there's certain roles that are internet-facing. So you're having to get those protected by either NAT rules or putting them in a DMZ is really difficult, and needs a lot of thought and implementation around getting it right. Windows Virtual Desktop removes all that because that is Microsoft's responsibility in their responsibility sort of chart.
Right.
You don't have to worry. All you have to worry about is the session host and the app deployment. If you're doing the application groups, and there's stuff like MS App Attach now that that again because of this was right at the beginning of COVID, I didn't have any of those features. The feature set that is available now is so much, and it's great to see how far it's come in such a short time. And it's probably because of the pandemic that it's happened. I think in hindsight, if it wasn't because of the pandemic, I don't think Windows Virtual Desktop would be anywhere near to where it is now, because they've had to, in a short space of time themselves, put a lot of development into it. They're an amazing job, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you hit on those key points around that multi-session license of Windows Desktop, and a lot of that licensing now comes within the Microsoft 365 packaging, and then identity planning for identity is just something that is just, if you're moving to the cloud, you have to figure out how you're going to plan for your identity, how you're going to handle that hybrid identity environment. And that's one of the key things, like you pointed out with Windows Virtual Desktop. It does run still around that whole domain services structure rather than really in Azure Active Directory. So whether you're running your entire organization within Azure, you still need to utilize that ADDS service, that Azure ADDS service within Azure to emulate that on-premises Active Directory domain at this point. I'm assuming that might change over time as like you said, Windows Virtual Desktop evolves and everything. But that, understanding identity, and I know you've done a lot of videos on identity and access management, and I've done my share, and I've taught AZ 500 quite a few times, and you spend a whole day in just that class for that certification talking about identity, and and identity. It's just identity is the thing is when you're talking about the cloud is utmost importance, how you're taking care of that. So
I think that's, but the base of Microsoft Cloud and Azure, I think it sits, the identity is where everything sits on top of. When people speak about on-premises sort of implementations, I always say, well, you need to understand networking, because everything, no matter what it is, be it virtual machines, applications, they all sit on your network. Essentially, that is essential. In the cloud, identity is essential, because even if it's a SaaS, PaaS, infrastructure as a service, doesn't matter. It sits on top of your identity. Whereas networking, you only got your infrastructure as a service that needs networking. Really, it's important for that, but identity is the bedrock of cloud services, and I think you have to get that right. What I'm doing at the moment is a lot of the discussions I'm having with customers is I recommend Azure Active Directory domain services rather than having that on-premises integration. And the main reason is that you're then reliant on that VPN, because you need that VPN at the moment to have that on-premise integration. And if that goes down, your users can't access your Windows Virtual Desktop because they won't be able to.
Right.
They won't be able to authenticate. Whereas if you have the on-premises, if you have you take that away, your identity access is all in Azure.
Yeah.
So you've got that HA, the highly available. You have two IP addresses with Azure AD domain services. So it just takes away, mitigates that risk. So I'm trying to say to customers that, look, I understand you need that group policy, but I would recommend having Azure AD domain services because look at the risk there. You've got what's more important. As I said, with Intune integration coming more and more into Windows Virtual Desktop, that sort of control and policies are all going to be there now, if not soon in the near future. So that's what I'm trying to point my kind of clients I'm having conversations with towards.
I have a question. It seems like the integration what you have done for the public sector and for the healthcare. I have an exactly same situation, but it's not Windows Virtual Desktop yet, but it's Citrix.
Okay.
So I'm for many years an Citrix expert. Of course, now lately here in Belgium there is no so many implementations of Citrix, so I'm concentrating a lot more on Windows Virtual Desktops. Did you had any issues with identities like single sign-on during logging into Windows Virtual Desktop when it's Active Directory domain services joined? So when that is implemented, so when users log on into their desktop, of course you can apply also policies in the Active Directory domain services. So, but what my experience is that when users log on into Windows Virtual Desktop, which are Active Directory domain services joined, is that a lot of single sign-on processes not work correctly as they should be, like registering the desktop, from that kind of stuff. Did you have any kind of issues with that in the past?
So with the so as you mentioned, with the Azure AD domain services, you do get a group policy, but it's like a fresh group policy, even though it's the same domain as your on-premises, because it's got the sync with Azure AD. Now, what you have to do is, then again, I don't know if this is going to answer your question or not, but once you've provisioned Azure AD domain services, because Azure AD is a password hash, and Azure AD domain services is kind of Kerberos and NTLM, your Azure AD users have to change their passwords. And what that does is that converts their account into a account that can log on to resources with Azure AD domain services. So there has to be a password change first. Otherwise, yes, you're right, they can't authenticate. That's the only requirement I know, and that was the only thing that would have caused us issues, but we knew about it already, that users had to change their password, Azure AD users. So even if they've got a hybrid account with on-premises and Azure AD, they still have to change their password before their account will sync with Azure AD domain services. Does that answer your question?
Yes, a little bit, but do they need to change their password before logging on into Windows Virtual Desktop?
Yes.
So, for example, in the SaaS web application.
Yes.
Okay.
So once Azure AD domain service is provisioned and it's kind of syncing with Azure AD, users have to change their Azure AD password. Otherwise, they can't authenticate to the Windows 10 session hosts, because those session hosts are being managed by Azure AD domain services tenant.
Yes. Yeah.
And until they change their password, it doesn't do that conversion of the password hash, because it's stored, the password stored differently in Azure AD as it is in Azure AD domain services.
Okay. I didn't know about that, because we had a lot of issues. So we almost regret about joining those desktops to Azure AD because of the of the missing functionality of pass-through authentication, about registering the desktops in Azure AD. A lot of things would not work, of course, if that process has not gone correctly.
We built it into our documentation that users had to change their password before they were able to access it. We made sure that was in the documentation, that all key stakeholders knew about it, and it was communicated to the users. But yeah, that unfortunately that is quite a key element in getting that identity functionality working correctly.
Okay, and did you enforce them using using a manual, or using passport enforcement in Azure AD, or how do you enforce the users that they? I know users are big problems. Even if you create manuals as much as you can, but they don't read it if it's not a one-pager and it has 10 pages. So,
what I again, I'm not sure how. In my experience, what I had to do was teach so a lot of these clients that I worked with have their own IT departments, but they just don't have that skill set. So that's why they're bringing people like us who do. I had to train the support teams in how to do it. Okay, this is how you change your password. Here's a documentation. And then it was almost their role, their job to enforce it, be it through forcing password change. So if it is on premises, you can do that, or by actually having to have remote sessions with groups of people, groups of users to say, right, now do this, now do that. And that, unfortunately, that is how far we had to go with some companies. We had to literally hold their hand and go through it. It's just one of the, like you said, users are users. There's nothing, we wouldn't be here without them. But those are the lengths that we have to go to. You can enforce password change and all sorts, but it's still one of those things. And again, because of the urgency, we had to put in that time to make sure people did do it. Otherwise, we'd get tickets logged around. Well, I can't log in. And be like, okay, well, change your password. No. Well, we told you to. Oh, well, I didn't read that email. It's like, for God's sake.
Almost always the same issue. Yeah, that's right. Okay, thank you.
It's my pleasure. No problem.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm putting a couple links in the chat as well. I put Shabaz's "I am a geek." I'm an IT geek. Sorry, IT geek. Link to his YouTube channel, and I have a YouTube channel as well where I will provide. This is also where this recording of this meeting will be here, probably by the end of the week as well. But I know Shabaz does a lot of different YouTube sessions. I've done quite a few on security and networking myself. So we're both active in doing that, as well as speaking at user groups and doing our own user groups and things like that. So so those are a couple good links, and for those of you that have joined, and I see we had one late joiner as well, but I will let them as well benefit from the little giveaway that we're having, thanks to our sponsor Skylines Academy. And this link here will get you a free subscription membership to Skylines Academy. So go to that link. Log yourself in. It'll have the code for you, and then you can join Skylines Academy. Like I said, they have, if you're looking at any Microsoft certifications, they have some great courses on there. So no problem, Matthew. No problem having the time wrong. That's all right. It is recorded. Like I said, I just put in the chat the link where it'll be on the Captain Hyperscaler YouTube channel. It'll be here later this week. But like I said, you did join just in time to get the free membership giveaway. So
yeah, that's cool. Yes, sorry about that. I was looking forward to
no worries.
to listen to your presentation, but I'll definitely catch the recording if that's
no
available
problem.
at the end.
No worries.
But yeah, so yeah, thanks everybody for attending today, and Shabaz, thank you very much for this great presentation. I've been looking forward to it since I got it on the schedule because, like I said, I've been around the virtual desktop environment quite a bit in my career, and really like what Microsoft has done with the Windows Virtual Desktop environment. So, and looking, like you said, it's only a year old, and like you said, the pandemic I think accelerated it quite a bit into reality, but look forward to seeing where it goes. And I know, Khalid, you mentioned the Citrix environment. I've worked on some things with Microsoft around their virtual desktop in messaging and playbook in terms of that, and they're doing some things as well with Citrix as well as VMware. That's all part of that virtual desktop environment as well as, for that integration. So it's definitely some good things to come, as you work with Windows Virtual Desktop and have your knowledge of Citrix, that'll probably come in beneficial. So.
Yeah, I think also. I've started. I think I think a decade more than a decade since I was 18. So it must almost be 21 years working with Citrix. So a lot of things make sense. Also for Windows Virtual Desktop. But in the beginning, it was so complicated. They created how you can build an images, how you can maintain the images, and it was so complicated. And if I look back then, how I managed Citrix images at this moment, I can do that in a couple of minutes. And if I look to the JSON templates and all that kind of stuff and PowerShell scripts, what you need to build a good image, it was a little bit hard. It was also a little bit
and
scary.
Microsoft didn't make it easy from a licensing standpoint either.
Absolutely.
with
the licensing is another part.
We talked about you mentioned the RDP licensing and all of that.
Oh my God. Yes.
And then the what was it, the VDA licensing, if you wanted a dedicated host for your users versus a shared host, and all of those things. So yeah, I've been around the engineers having those conversations.
Yeah.
I don't think even the Microsoft licensing team understand Microsoft licensing from the conversation. So it's
that's the great thing though with the Microsoft 365 multi-session licensing. They've gotten rid of a lot of that confusion. If you get a user just on that enterprise licensing now, that gets away with all, gets you out of that whole muck of the VDA licensing and the Windows licensing and all that. It all packages nicely together with 365. So
yeah.
So I think they've learned their lessons there. All right, great, everybody. Well, thank you very much. Again, we got another meeting in a couple weeks. It's all my meetings are on meetups. I've got to get the February and March up there on meetups, but certainly feel free to join the meetups so you get your alerts on when other meetings are coming up with other speakers. And again, Shabaz, thank you very much. Appreciate you taking the time, and appreciate everybody joining today.